Good morning readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and today I'm here to do a short review. So I'm going to be reviewing The Return of the Soldier by Rebecca West, which was published in 1918 and deals with the story of Chris, who comes back from being a soldier in World War I with some significant mental trauma as a result of his time in the battle. Not your typical shell shock, but still a big impact on his view of the world. I'll go into that a little bit more later on. So when I first started this channel, I thought that what I would mostly be doing would be reviews, and I didn't realise just how much time and effort it takes to make a good review. So for the new year, one thing that I want to do to make sure that I'm doing reviews is to do reviews that are a little bit maybe briefer, I don't know, because I'm good at rambling, but that take me minutes rather than hours to prepare for. So I have just got some of the notes that I was making as I was reading The Return of the Soldier, and I've kind of put them into some kind of order, but I haven't done any of the kind of intense, heavy preparation that I used to do for reviews. This isn't going to be saying anything particularly innovative and insightful. It is just my initial impressions of The Return of the Soldier, and that's something that I'm hopefully going to do a few of this year. So that little explanation aside, we can proceed with talking about The Return of the Soldier. So like I said, this is a 1918 story by Rebecca West. So it was written and published at a time when the war was still very, very fresh and very, very real. I think that it was published while the war was still ongoing, and a lot of women in England and in the UK would have been in the position of the women in this book who are waiting for the return of the soldier and anxious about how the soldier will have been affected by the battles that he has been in. So it was a very fresh and raw topic that Rebecca West chose to explore. I read this book on Serial Reader, which is why I don't have a copy to lift up, and if you did want to read it, it was only 10 issues on that. So if each of their issues are about 10 minutes long, that's like an hour and 40 minutes worth of reading. It's not a book that's going to be a huge time investment, but it was definitely one that gave me stuff to think about. I know for myself that that kind of period of writing, particularly between the First and Second World Wars by women authors, that is a period where the writing style I always tend to really enjoy, and my mum Roz had read this and recommended it towards the end of last year, so between those things I just knew that I was in for probably quite a good little book. So the book opens in that classic English setting of a country estate. This book is really about the woman's experience. There's two women in this great country house, and they are already talking about and thinking about and wondering about Chris, who is their soldier, the soldier that they are waiting for. So Serial Reader's on my phone, so I haven't got access to anything that I want to quote, but I'm going to try and use my memory. See how that goes. There is one moment where the narrator, Jenny, says, "It was a lovely day, but it seemed almost not right that the day was so lovely because I, like many women at the time, was waiting for the return of the soldier." And she talks about how patriotism is pushed aside in this kind of strong desire that they have to see their men come home. So there's a lot of kind of subdued passion even at the very beginning. There's another thing that's set up in the very first chapter, and that is the sense of a family that is incomplete, not just because of the soldier being missing, but because of another male character that is missing, and that is their son, who unfortunately passed away at a very young age. Just the very slight mention of that in the first chapter gives us this sense of slight unease and things that aren't just quite as perfect as they could be in this beautiful country estate that is described as being some kind of like wonderful place and almost like a heavenly place. We get a sense that things on the surface might be lovely, but things lower down are a little bit less secure. Right at the beginning, Jenny talks about how she and Kitty had worked so hard to make the house and the country estate a perfect place for Chris, and she says, "Here we had made happiness inevitable for him," and she talks about all of the effort that they had put into ensuring that. And that immediately makes the reader question and wonder, why did they have to make happiness inevitable? Like, why was Chris not happy already? And again, it contributes to that sense of there being something slightly wrong, something that should make us slightly uneasy, some kind of disguised or hidden problem in the house that is going to come out as Chris returns. And I think that's good foreshadowing for things that are to come and how the story goes on to play out. Into this serene and peaceful environment where these two women, Jenny and Kitty, Jenny who is the soldier's cousin and Kitty who is the soldier's wife, into their serene environment suddenly comes something that doesn't fit. And that is another woman who will become the other key important woman of the plot. And that is a woman who Chris knew 15 years before, and her name is Margaret. and she does not fit into this serene world. There's a lot of description put into all of the little things about her that make her not quite right for the surface of perfection that has been generated by Jenny and Kitty, kind of collaborating to create this perfect world. And this woman comes to tell them that Chris is ill, and that immediately brings in a huge amount of drama and tension. And, you know, do they believe her? Is she somebody that they can trust? Is she out for money? Because there's a strong classist element to this book, which I'll hopefully come back to later. Just moving on to like the second chapter, so not telling you too much of the plot. It turns out that this woman is right. Chris is ill, but not in the conventional sense. So one of their first responses when she says Chris is ill, they say, is he wounded? And she says yes, but you can tell from the way that she says it that it's not quite right, and it isn't quite right. So Chris comes back to them with significant memory loss, and it's not made entirely clear what this memory loss has come from, whether it's a result of shock or whether it's, my gut feeling would be that it would be the result of a head injury. Now, I'm not sure entirely how realistic this idea of a head injury that knocks out 15 years of your life is, but that is what happens. Chris comes back and he cannot remember the last 15 years of his life. And so the book is set up, and so it goes on to examine how losing 15 years of your life affects you and the people around you. So there's a couple of different themes that come into play in this book. There's obviously the theme of the war. There is a strong theme of sort of mental health or mental functioning, sort of the world of the mind. There's a strong theme of class, like I've mentioned. But most of all, to me, this is a love story. It's an interesting and uncomfortable love story, but it is a love story. It's about lovers reunited. It's about the passion of early youth and what happens to that passion in later life. And a lot of the question of the first half of the book is love timeless? Is love something that can continue over that huge gulf of time? And if you see someone who you kind of know that you love, but they have changed in that they have got 15 years worth of difference to them, will you still feel the same way? And it's about what happens to sort of break a romantic connection as well. Yeah, and why the characters are in the position that they're in, where Chris is in this kind of uncomfortably perfect house, and Margaret, the woman that he used to love, is not his wife the way that he kind of would have expected from the perspective that he had in his last memory that he is able to use, if that makes any sense. Yeah, and it unpicks that, and there's a lot of, not exactly flashback, but Margaret tells her side of things of why things have happened the way they've happened, and Chris tells his side of things of you know, why he loves Margaret so much. And Jenny and Kitty kind of have their side as well. So this book, it's a love story, it's also a love triangle, so it's about Kitty's feelings for Chris, and throughout Kitty is portrayed quite unsympathetically. She is maybe the least sensitive character. She's the one that most struggles with the idea of Chris as being ill. And then Jenny, bit by bit we come to realise that Jenny has some very strong feelings for Chris of her own, and it's presented quite subtly. It never comes out and says, oh, I loved Chris so much, but it does say things like she notices things about him that we are used to seeing in literature, things that a character will notice that shows that they're in love with that character. So she notices the different shades of his hair, and things like that imply to us that Jenny actually powerfully loves Chris, even though that is a relationship that has never gone anywhere and has remained completely sort of platonic. And then of course there's Margaret, who loved Chris passionately 15 years ago and sort of never stopped loving him, I suppose. So yeah, there's a very strong love story aspect to it, and we kind of, as the reader, we kind of don't know where to put our support. We don't know whether we want sort of Chris and Margaret to work out, who they've got this huge 15-year gap, but they had that kind of, the first love that we're so used to sort of getting behind in literature, the kind of really romantically powerful connection. And then we don't know whether it's poor Kitty, who, you know, has been married to Chris for years, like whether to support her, because it's tragic that the war has caused her to lose her husband, not in the way that she expected to lose him, but in this bizarre and almost unaccountable and unfathomable way. And then there was a part of me who really wanted Jenny to get some kind of reciprocation for her feelings. So yeah, there was definitely a good amount of romantic tension and love story development to this book, and that provided the plot on which the other themes could cling. Another theme that I mentioned was the war, and the war kind of connects into the love story. in that when Chris first fell in love with Margaret, the war it hadn't yet begun. It was not even something that anybody was anticipating. He does not know anything that has happened in that time, and a part of Chris's role for the reader is to sort of question, how on earth did we get to this position? So there's one point where he's reading a newspaper and he says, did they really do this to Belgium? You know, how did that happen? And sort of questioning how times got to that pitch, and the other characters sort of don't really know how to explain that to him. But also, the war is always hanging over them. Right at the beginning, when Jenny is talking about how much she's longing for the return of the soldier, she talks about how much she is terrified for Chris. I did actually copy a quote out for this. Of late, I had had bad dreams about him. By nights, I saw Chris running across the brown rottenness of no man's land, starting back here because he had trod upon a hand, not even looking there because of the awfulness of an unburied head. And not till my dream was packed full of horror did I see him pitch forward on his knees as he reached safety, if it was that. And we can see the extremity of her anxiety for him. And she's not actually in this dream worrying about his physical safety. She's worrying about the horrors that he is having to witness. And that is interesting because it is those horrors that in some way contribute to his mental state when he returns, one would suppose. There is the sense that there is the potential for Chris to go back to that war, and at the moment the reason why he is not going back is because of his mental condition. Jenny actually starts to speculate on this and realise that Margaret is protecting Chris because for as long as he believes that he's in love with Margaret and doesn't have this memory of the last 15 years, he's protected, he's safe, he can't go back to the war because he couldn't function as a soldier without any understanding of what's going on. She is reluctant to see him cured, and we'll talk about the cure idea later, because she wants him to stay safe. And when Chris meets Margaret after 15 years for the first time, as he runs towards him, there is a metaphor about how he looks like that soldier from Jenny's dream. He looks like he's in that position of running through the wasteland to safety, and Margaret is that safety. So I think it's interesting how she plays that role for him. One of the things that the war represents in this story is real life, and the fact that he can't run from real life forever, and he will at some stage have to confront or have to begin to build some kind of understanding of the time that he's lost in order to be able to go on with his life, whether or not that means to remember those 15 years or whether it means to just accept that they've happened. He can't forever be sheltered from the horror of real life, including the horror of the war. So also from that idea of the war being real life and his mental condition protecting him from the war, I thought we could talk a little bit more about the idea of mental health in the story. It's obviously what Chris has got. It's not the same as shell shock or the sort of PTSD as we would now see it. It's not a kind of a standard kind of panic breakdown response to the battle. It is just a complete and utter erasure of the memory of the battle, and been away for about a year, so the 14 years before he had any experience of that battle. And the two women from his home are quite determined that he should be cured. Jenny, as the time goes on, she begins to sort of question her ideas about that as she sees Chris with Margaret, and as she thinks about the fact that if Chris is cured, he will have to go back to the war. She begins to take a more nuanced approach to that. But Kitty is so determined that Chris should recover his memory, that he should be cured, and they see multiple specialists in an attempt to allow this to happen. But the book doesn't present Chris as somebody who needs to be cured. It presents him as somebody who is actually in the happiest state possible. He's in love, he's in a beautiful place, and he's away from the war. It presents his experience of that time as being quite idyllic. So I think it is designed to make us question what we see of as what is right for the mind. And Chris's innocence is almost something that we are encouraged to envy, even though we know that maybe there's something not quite right about it. There was one quote, again, that I copied out that I thought was quite interesting and quite forward-thinking for the time, because, you know, at this point in the First World War, soldiers were shot for having mental trauma. So I found it interesting the way that Rebecca West sort of handled this theme and took it on quite boldly. So I'll read you that little extract now. "I've always said," declared Kitty with an air of good sense, "that if he would make an effort, this is the doctor." He jerked his round head about. "The mental life that can be controlled by effort isn't the mental life that matters. You've been stuffed up when you were young with talk about a thing called self-control, a sort of barmaid of the soul that says, 'Time's up, gentlemen, and here you've had enough.' There's no such thing. I think that has relevance even to this day. I think people still sort of believe in the idea that people can pull themselves together, which is something that Kitty very definitely believes in this story, that Chris is in denial as opposed to having a genuine condition. The other aspect of the sort of mental health component of the book is it does sort of begin to drift into the weird world of psychoanalysis. I think because of the kind of newness of that topic, it begins to kind of slide into that in a way that I found maybe not entirely necessary, but that is very, very brief as a part of the book, so not something to be too bothered about. And it also looks at how they kind of don't really have the vocabulary and the manner in which to understand this idea of Chris's illness, because they're not even sure whether it is an illness, and we as the reader aren't even sure if it is an illness, because he is so happy and so fully healthy and well and youthful. Like, there's a lot of references to how, because he thinks he's 15 years younger than he is, he goes and he does boyish things. He's not the kind of time-worn man that he's become. He's this kind of like 25-year-old youth with a lot of vitality to him. So I mentioned at the beginning when Margaret first arrives into their life and she says Chris is ill, and you can tell that, you know, she really believes it, but then she also doesn't know whether it's quite right. And I think that that was something that Rebecca West was trying to raise, like, what is this kind of illness and what does it mean to be made ill by a war in a way that isn't a physical injury, which was something that they were beginning to have to think about quite a lot at that time. So I think I've got through the main key themes that I wanted to mention. The other things that I wanted to say were just that I really liked and appreciated the writing style. I liked the narrative viewpoint of Jenny, because there's a lot of references to how unimportant she is, like characters walk past her without recognising her. When this doctor arrives who is trying to cure Chris, he kind of sizes her up, and Jenny herself says, he realised that I was unimportant and looked away. But she's the one that kind of connects all the dots and looks at what's going on and puts it all together for the reader in a way that neither Kitty nor Margaret could. And it falls upon her to do a lot of the tragic hard work of dealing with the situation. She has to go and be the one who reunites Margaret and Chris, because Chris so passionately wants this to happen. She has to be the one who thinks about Kitty's bereavement in a way that Kitty herself doesn't even sort of think about it. So I liked Jenny's role as the narrator, and she does get quite emotional at times, and I felt like I could follow her emotions because I kind of got into her and appreciated her as a character. There's also a lot of lovely talk about nature in this book. I really enjoyed that aspect. I think that's kind of like a common theme for books from this period, is a lot of use of nature in descriptions, and I always really enjoy that. I kind of miss that in modern books. I find that it makes the kind of the setting so much richer, and that has reminded me that I didn't actually go back to talk about class, because a lot of the description of nature is about the description of the country estate, and that is not Margaret's world. So you have Jenny and Kitty, who I've mentioned, they live on the country estate. Margaret does not. Margaret lives in an industrial town, and there is this kind of biting comment at the beginning when Margaret first appears about how, you know, how difficult it is these days to keep those people from the industrial towns outside of one's life. Like the idea that you should be able to preserve your country estate completely untouched by all of these people from the lower classes, essentially. And even Jenny, who I found quite insightful and quite relatable, is powerfully classist at times in the way that she interacts with Margaret, and they kind of all see Margaret as not being good enough for Chris, not because of her personality, but because of the clothes she wears and the difficulties that she's faced in her life due to her class. They kind of see that as leaving her kind of worn down and bedraggled in a way that Chris shouldn't have to experience. As the book goes on, because Jenny begins to question her viewpoint about that a little bit, you as a reader begin to question your viewpoint as well. And, you know, coming as a 21st century reader, I don't come with those same class preconceptions, but I can see that a reader at the time would begin to be pushed into that if they had felt that, you know, the industrial town should be kept separate from the country estates. They might have been pushed to question that a little bit more. And the way that Margaret is kind of placed into nature, like there's a lot of moments where she's sort of like, there's one point where she's standing next to a statue of ideal womanhood, and we're left to kind of question, is Margaret the ideal woman? Is Kitty the ideal woman? Or is Rebecca West kind of saying that this idea of the ideal woman isn't strictly true or relevant, if that makes sense? So I liked how ideas of class were brought into question. Having class as such a strong theme is a very English thing, I think. And this is a period of English literature in which class becomes, it really comes to the fore, if that makes sense. So if you read Jane Austen books, there's almost nothing about, there's stuff about class in them, but it's more about distinctions within the upper classes. And the lower classes, you know, the servants and so on, they essentially do not exist. Going forward into something like Dickens, class distinctions are there, but people kind of talk to people who are a lower class because it's kind of like this weird, interesting, exotic thing, and they need to like bestow charity upon them or something like that. And there is definitely presented as being like a huge gulf there. Going on into this period of English literature, the differences in people's classes are called into question, and particularly with so many people all dying in the First World War, like the war knew no class distinctions. Essentially the entire system began to be called into question as a result of, well, linked to the First World War, and also other changes that were going on in the country over that period. And I think part of what this book could be said to be about is about that questioning of class boundaries, because in many ways Margaret is presented as being more pure. In spite of the position that Margaret is in society, she is shown as having the capacity to be so much more, to be sort of the essence of womanhood. And so again, Rebecca West encourages us to question our preconceptions. So that was enjoyable and quite interesting as an element. I think that brings me to the end of the majority of what I had to say about The Return of the Soldier. I really enjoyed it, and because it is such a short read in terms of being like a 20th century classic, it is very, very accessible, so I would encourage other people to read it. And yeah, get back to me with what you thought. If you have read other books from a similar period or other books that contain similar themes, do please bring them up in the comments. I would love for this to open out a little bit more into a bit of a discussion, and I always like to hear about other books that kind of deal with similar topics. Yeah, generally I hope to talk to you in the comments. So thank you very much for watching. This was the first book that I finished in 2019, did I say that? So I'm happy that I'm kind of underway for a bit of good reading. Happy reading, and I will speak to you soon.